When I inherited my grandfather's cabin, nestled by the edge of Pine Hollow Lake in Oregon, I thought it would be the beginning of something peaceful. My name's Caleb Morgan, 34, a software developer from Portland, and that cabin had always been my childhood haven. Grandpa Ray built it back in 1965, long before the place was trendy or valuable, and it stayed pretty much untouched for decades. Quiet, calm, wrapped in pine trees, with a front porch facing the glassy lake. It felt like stepping out of the world. That peace lasted about 20 minutes. After I arrived for the first time since the funeral, I was on the phone with my fiancée, Riley, telling her how the place looked exactly the same when I heard a knock on the door. Not the kind of knock you expect at a lakeside cabin. It was stiff, sharp, like a debt collector showing up uninvited. I opened the door to find a woman maybe in her late 30s standing there, like she owned the property. Her name was Lacey Harwood. She wore a pastel pantsuit that tried to scream authority but whispered, "Discount Mall," with a clipboard in one hand and a smile that felt anything but warm. She introduced herself as the president of the Pine Hollow Lakefront Community Association and immediately informed me that I was being fined $500. Why? Because, she said, my trash bin was 6 inches out of compliance. I thought it was a joke. She didn't laugh. Apparently, the bin was supposed to be 18 inches from the edge of the gravel road, facing a specific direction, and mine had been positioned incorrectly, despite the fact that I hadn't even taken out any trash yet. She handed me a thick envelope with community guidelines, highlighted infractions, and a payment slip. I told her my grandfather had lived here for almost 60 years and never once mentioned a homeowners association. Lacey's smile stretched a little wider, like she'd been waiting for me to say that. She said, the HOA was formed in 2020, and that while Grandpa had been exempt under a legacy clause, my ownership voided that. Now, the property had to conform to all current standards. I stood there stunned as she flipped through a series of violations I didn't even understand. Something about the wood color of the cabin, the length of the grass, the fencing being too rustic, and a long section called Architectural Visual Compliance. She said I had 30 days to start the updates or face escalating fines and legal action. I watched her walk away in those ridiculous heels, clicking down my gravel path like she was auditioning for a reality show. And all I could think about was how wrong this all felt. That cabin was more than just property. It was the last piece of my grandfather's legacy. I wasn't about to let anyone reduce it to a list of aesthetic violations. Still, I tried to play along. I repainted the cabin in HOA-approved colors, a dull beige that made the place look like it belonged in a retirement brochure. I replaced the old cedar fence with vinyl. I mowed the lawn every 3 days, and even used a tape measure to make sure the grass stayed within their perfect height range. I followed every ridiculous rule, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, Lacey returned, clipboard in hand, that same sugary smile, but this time with new violations. My car had allegedly been parked at a 3-degree angle from the driveway line. My porch chair wasn't aligned with the front door. The small bird feeder Grandpa had hung decades ago, now considered an environmental risk due to seed shell dispersion. The breaking point came one Saturday morning when I stepped outside and saw a team of people in reflective vests walking through my yard with measuring tapes, notepads, and a camera with a telephoto lens. Lacey stood behind them, barking orders like a general on a mission. When I confronted her, she told me it was the monthly compliance check. I said I never received any notice. She replied that it was emailed, and when I checked, sure enough, it was buried in my spam folder. She smiled as if the mistake was mine. I started recording every interaction after that. The moment she stepped onto my property, my phone was in my pocket, mic on. I also began digging through property law and discovered something important. Since the cabin predated the HOA by over 50 years, and the community rules had never been formally recorded against the deed, There was a legal loophole. I called a lawyer, Mason Kane, and he confirmed it. I might have standing to fight this, but it would take time. Meanwhile, I met my neighbor, Doris Bennett. She was in her early 60s. Calm voice, sharp eyes. She'd lived next door since the early 2000s and had seen Lacey tear through the neighborhood like a tornado in heels. Doris told me stories about how other families had been fined out of their homes, how children's toys had been declared violations, how garden gnomes and welcome signs were removed for nonconformity. Lacey wasn't just enforcing rules, she was enforcing power. But she didn't know who I was. I wasn't just a guy with a lake house. I was someone who had spent years building tech platforms, navigating contracts, reading between lines. I knew how systems worked and how to break them down legally. I wasn't going to pick a fight. I was going to change the game entirely. The harassment didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. Lacey returned a week later with what she called an official HOA inspection team. 3 people in neon vests and clipboards walked around my property like they were appraisers from a federal agency. They measured distances between porch furniture and windows, took notes on the angle of my mailbox, and even held up a color swatch to my newly painted fence to compare its hue with the HOA-approved palette. I watched them from the front porch with a coffee in one hand and my phone recording in the other. When I asked what legal right they had to be on my property, Lacey simply pointed to the community guidelines and said that routine inspections were allowed. She smiled like she thought that would be the end of the conversation. But I had already learned enough to know that these guidelines didn't apply to my property in the way she assumed. Mason, my lawyer, confirmed it again. Since the HOA had been formed after my grandfather had built the cabin, and since there was no record of any updated agreement in the county registrar, I had grounds to challenge nearly all of their demands. I let them finish their little inspections, smiled politely, and waited. Then I uploaded the footage of Lacey and her entourage to social media, titling it, HOA President Tries to Intimidate Legacy Property Owner. I didn't expect it to blow up, but within days, the video had over 200,000 views and comments from people all over the country sharing their HOA nightmares. Some of them were worse than mine, but most of them were angry. Really angry. That's when things changed. Not in the way I hoped, though. The viral video didn't scare Lacey off. It lit a fire under her. She doubled down. She started calling local contractors, warning them about doing work on my property. Said I was difficult, that I didn't pay bills. Suddenly, landscapers wouldn't return my calls. A pest control guy canceled an appointment 20 minutes before he was due. When I finally got someone to fix a plumbing issue, they said I'd have to pay up front, cash only. I knew why, and then things got worse. My mail started arriving late or not at all. Packages were marked as undeliverable. Lacey filed noise complaints to the sheriff about my dog barking, even though I didn't have a dog. One night, I found a notice taped to my door saying I was in violation of HOA rules for excessive late-night activity at 9:45 p.m. when I had been reading on the couch in silence. The next day, my girlfriend Riley came to visit, and I noticed a car with tinted windows parked near the edge of the woods, camera lens poking out the passenger window. I walked over. The man inside rolled the window down a few inches. He said he was a private investigator working for the HOA. I laughed. Then I called Mason again. He said this was textbook harassment and we could take legal action, but that it would be slow, expensive, and dependent on the court's appetite for these kinds of cases. In the meantime, I'd be on the receiving end of 1,000 paper cuts designed to push me out. That's when Doris showed up with a thermos of hot tea and a stack of folders. She'd been documenting Lacey's behavior for months, maybe years. Photographs of inspections, copies of notices, receipts from neighbors who had been fined into bankruptcy. even sworn statements from families who had left the community altogether. One by one, the stories painted a picture of systematic bullying under the guise of community standards. I spent that night reading every page. I barely slept. The next morning, I stood in the middle of the property Grandpa Ray built with his own hands and made a decision. I wasn't going anywhere. And I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to take control of the one thing Lacey didn't know she didn't own. The lake. Pine Hollow Lake sat like a jewel at the center of our community. All the lakefront homes, including mine, orbited around it like planets. People fished there, swam, took their boats out. The HOA bragged about lake access in every one of their promotional brochures. But here's the thing they never told you. My grandfather was friends with the man who originally owned the land surrounding the lake, and the usage rights had always been informal, never legally recorded. The true owner? An old rancher named Everett Vaughn. I called him. He was 72, living in Montana now, but he still remembered my grandfather like they'd spoken last week. I told him what had been happening. He listened, then told me something that made me sit straight up. He said he still owned the lake and was planning to sell the land soon. Developers had already made offers. But he hated the idea of people like Lacey turning the place into a gated resort. If I could match the offer and show him a plan that preserved the land's natural beauty, he'd rather sell to me the offer. $2 million. It was a fortune, but with the equity from my Portland home, a loan from a friend who ran an investment firm, and some of the inheritance Grandpa left me, I could pull it off. Barely. I ran the numbers twice, then 3 more times. If I bought the lake and the road leading into it, the HOA would lose its most valuable asset overnight. No more access. No more leverage. No more fake power. It would take 2 weeks to close the deal. I didn't say a word to Lacey. I just smiled when she knocked on my door again to tell me my lawn gnome was a violation of aesthetic harmony. I thanked her for the notice and offered her tea. She declined. I knew she had no idea what was coming. The day the deal closed was a Wednesday. Quiet, unassuming, the kind of day that wouldn't make the news. But for me, it felt like D-Day. I signed the final paperwork at the county recorder's office with Everett sitting across from me in a worn flannel shirt and work jeans. He handed over the keys to the old boat dock, slapped my back like I was a nephew, and told me, "Make 'em earn it, son." As I walked out of that office, I wasn't just a cabin owner anymore. I owned the lake, the boat launch, the road leading into the water, and the shoreline used for every HOA event. All of it. Lacey had no idea the ground beneath her rule had just shifted. She was too busy preparing for Clearwater Pine's annual summer festival. It was her pride and joy, the HOA's biggest event of the year, a saccharine celebration of neighborhood unity complete with banners, food trucks, and a boat parade that launched, of course, from my dock. I let her plan it. I let her send out the flyers and schedule the music. And then, 2 days before the festival, I had my lawyer draft a letter. It was polite, professional, and absolutely devastating. Effective immediately, all HOA access to the lake and its facilities was revoked. No boats, no events, no use of the dock or shoreline without express written permission from the new owner. I even included laminated signs and a small chain-link gate with a padlock. I dropped the envelope off at her house personally. When she opened the door and saw it was me, her smile flickered like a dying light bulb. "What now?" she asked. "Just some paperwork," I said, handing her the letter with both hands. "You'll want to read it before Saturday." Then I walked away. No argument, no explanation. She shouted after me, but I didn't turn around. The next morning I sat on my porch sipping coffee as Lacey marched down the road toward the lake, a storm cloud in a sundress. She reached the dock, saw the sign, Private property, no trespassing without permission, and froze like someone had just unplugged her brain. She stared at the lock. A full 30 seconds passed before she turned on her heel and stomped back up the hill, phone already at her ear. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Unknown number. I didn't answer. 2 hours after that, she showed up on my porch, red-faced and rattled. "You can't do this," she said, without preamble. "You can't just take away community access to the lake. We've been using it for years. There's precedent." I let her rant. When she paused to breathe, I said calmly, "Lacey, the HOA never owned the lake. You assumed access. Now the owner has changed, and the new owner isn't interested in hosting your parade." Her nostrils flared. "You bought it just to spite me?" I raised an eyebrow. "No, I bought it to protect something my grandfather loved. You're just a bonus." She threatened legal action. I told her to go ahead. She threatened to report me to the county. I reminded her I had a deed, notarized and recorded, showing full legal ownership. She finally left, seething. But the damage was done. Word spread faster than fire in dry brush. Residents started calling the HOA office in a panic. Where would the festival be held? What about the fishing tournament? The kids' boat races? What about their lakefront privileges? Lacey tried to hold a last-minute board meeting to spin the story. She claimed the lake was undergoing maintenance and the festival would be moved to the park, but it didn't work. People weren't dumb. They'd seen the signs. They'd heard about the letter, and some of them had already been stopped from launching their kayaks that morning by a hired security guard I'd placed at the gate. I didn't want trouble. But I wasn't going to be steamrolled either. The festival turned into a disaster. Only half the food trucks showed up. The DJ canceled. The boat parade didn't happen at all. Families left early, disappointed and annoyed. Lacey gave a speech on a folding table set up near the tennis courts, trying to rally the crowd with talk of HOA unity and respect. But no one was listening. They were too busy murmuring about the lake, about how she'd let this happen, about how maybe it was time for a new president. That night, I sat on the dock with a cooler of beer and watched the stars reflect on the water. For the first time in months, the lake was quiet. No noise, no regulations, no fake smiles or clipboards, just stillness. Then I heard footsteps behind me. It was Sandra. She handed me a slice of pie and sat down beside me. "You really did it," she said. "Took back the whole damn lake." I nodded. "Still doesn't feel real." "Oh, it's real, all right." "Lacey's losing it. Half the board wants her out. The Johnsons are talking about filing a formal complaint. Martinez family, too." I didn't say anything, just listened to the water. "You know," Sandra added, "this could be bigger than just the lake. People are tired of being pushed around. Maybe it's time to start fresh, with someone who actually cares." I laughed. "I'm not running for HOA president." "Good," she said. "I am." And in that moment I knew the tide had truly turned, not because I'd won some personal vendetta, but because the community had finally woken up. And Lacey? She had no idea just how fast everything was slipping out of her hands. The following week unfolded like slow magma demolition. Lacey tried to hold the walls up with sheer denial, but cracks were spreading too fast to patch. First, it was the board. One by one, members who had once nodded along with every word she said began skipping meetings or quietly removing themselves from HOA group emails. Then came the petition. Sandra had wasted no time. With the community still buzzing from the failed summer festival and news of my ownership of Crystal Lake, she had gathered signatures with the precision of a military operation. 70% of residents signed within 5 days. The demand was simple: an emergency election to remove Lacey from her position. Lacey, of course, declared it invalid, said Sandra had used emotional coercion, whatever that meant. But the bylaws were clear. Enough signatures triggered a vote, and that vote was scheduled for the following Saturday. Meanwhile, I kept to myself, mostly. I repainted the dock, cut some brush along the trail, and planted a few pines near the cabin that Grandpa would have loved. Occasionally, a neighbor would pass by with a wave or an appreciative nod. One even dropped off a homemade peach cobbler with a handwritten note that just said, "Thank you." I didn't need applause. I just wanted peace. But Lacey couldn't stand peace. That Friday night, I caught her car's headlights creeping down my access road. I watched from the shadows as she parked at the edge of the lake and walked toward the dock in a long coat, something clutched in her hand. At first, I thought she was holding a flashlight. Then I realized it was a crowbar. She started toward the sign I'd posted at the edge of the dock: "Papery property. No trespassing." Her eyes darted like someone casing a bank. She didn't see me until I stepped into the moonlight. "Evening, Lacey," I said. Her scream nearly echoed across the water. She froze, crowbar still raised. "You scared me," she snapped. "Just taking a walk." "With a crowbar?" I stepped closer. "Midnight stroll or demolition derby." She lowered it slowly, trying to recover. "You don't understand what you've done. You've taken away something that belonged to this community." "I've taken back what never belonged to you," I replied. "You don't like it, but you don't get to rewrite history just because it inconveniences your fantasy." Her face twisted. Not in anger, in fear. It was the first time I truly saw it. This wasn't just a power trip for her. It was a lifeline. Without control, she was nothing. Just a scared woman in a borrowed identity. "I gave everything to this neighborhood," she whispered. "I made it beautiful." "You made it fearful," I said. "People weren't happy. They were quiet. That's not the same thing." I nodded toward the path. "You should go, before this becomes a real police matter." She hesitated, then dropped the crowbar with a metallic clatter and walked off into the dark. The next morning, half the neighborhood showed up for the vote. Sandra had organized it at the community center, coffee and donuts laid out like it was a school bake sale. Lacey arrived late, dressed in a stiff blazer and sunglasses, as if her downfall might be less humiliating if she looked composed. It didn't help. The vote wasn't even close. Of the 93 votes cast, only 6 were in her favor. 3 were blank. Sandra was elected interim president on the spot. Lacey stood there, blinking like someone had just unplugged her life support. "You can't do this," she said. "This is my community." "No, Lacey," Sandra replied. "It never was. You just borrowed it. And now we're taking it back." After the meeting, I walked outside into the fresh air and leaned against my truck. It was over, or so I thought. That afternoon, a realtor's sign appeared in front of Lacey's house. "For sale, by owner." The listing was live by sundown, but she hadn't even changed the curtains. It was a desperate move, and everyone knew it. The property value had already dipped with the festival debacle and the bad press. Word around the neighborhood was that no offers had come in by the end of the week. She'd priced it too high, out of stubbornness. Or pride, or both. A month later, the sign was still up, only now it read, "Price reduced." Meanwhile, Clearwater Pines had changed. Without the HOA's iron grip, neighbors began repainting their homes in actual colors. The Martinez family put up a small backyard stage for their son's band. The Johnsons replanted their vegetable garden. No one complained. Sandra rewrote the bylaws, eliminating vague rules and removing fines altogether. Enforcement, if needed, would come from mediation, not punishment. And me? I opened the lake. Not to everyone. just to residents who agreed to follow a simple honor system. Keep it clean, respect the water, treat each other like humans. It was beautiful. Every Saturday, the shoreline came alive again. Families picnicked, kids laughed, canoes slid across the surface like dragonflies. Sometimes I'd just sit on the dock, legs dangling, watching it all with a quiet satisfaction. One morning, Sandra joined me. "You know," she said, handing me a thermos of coffee, "Lacey's house finally sold." "Oh?" I asked. "To who?" She smiled. "A retired couple from Oregon said they moved here because they'd heard this was a neighborhood that had beaten its HOA, called it inspiring." We both laughed. It felt good. Not like revenge, not like triumph, just like peace. I stared across the lake and thought about Grandpa. He'd never fought a war like this, but he'd understand it just the same. Some things are worth standing up for, not because they're flashy or loud, but because they're quiet and true. The dock, the cabin, the lake, all of it was still here, but better now, because people had remembered how to be neighbors instead of prisoners. And Lacey? She was just a name now, a cautionary tale, a memory swept away like leaves in the wind. Fall came early that year in Clearwater Pines. The air turned crisp by mid-September, and the first leaves tumbled like gold coins across the gravel paths. On Saturday mornings, the lake mirrored the trees like it had done for decades, only now with more laughter echoing across the water. Without Lacey's rules, people came alive again. Front porches had pumpkins. Some even had painted fences that didn't match their neighbors. It was imperfect, and it was beautiful. I spent most mornings on the dock with a thermos of coffee, and the dog I'd adopted in August. His name was Scout, a shaggy mutt with one ear that never quite stood up. He'd been abandoned at the edge of town and wandered into my life like he belonged there, the same way this place had wandered back into mine. One morning, Sandra joined me again, this time bringing muffins instead of coffee. "They want to name the lakefront after your grandfather," she said, settling into the other chair. "Joe's Landing. What do you think?" I stared at the water, the sunlight warming its surface. "He'd have loved that," I said softly. "But he'd probably pretend to hate the attention." She smiled. "That's what makes it perfect. Life had a rhythm now, a real one. Not the forced cadence of dictated guidelines and clipboard inspections. A rhythm of porch visits and backyard barbecues and spontaneous help from neighbors who didn't need a rule book to be kind. Even Emma had returned. At first, it was awkward. She showed up with a hesitant smile and an overnight bag that suggested hope more than certainty. But we talked and walked and cooked dinner together like we had back before HOA fines and trash plumbing and shredded trust. Slowly, what was broken healed. I never sought revenge. I just wanted peace. But the universe, it seems, has its own sense of irony. Because just as I had forgotten about Lacey, the legal system had not. Ellis Carter called me one afternoon with an update. "She's being charged with multiple counts," he said. "Vandalism, harassment, fraud, interfering with business relations. They have emails, voicemails, your recordings. It's airtight." I didn't cheer. I didn't feel vindicated. I just exhaled. Long and slow. "She's trying to cut a deal," Ellis added. "Wants to avoid trial. Says she'll issue a public apology, pay restitution, and stay out of Clearwater Pines permanently." "I don't need an apology," I said. "Just make sure she doesn't come back." "She won't," he replied. "No one will let her." That night, I sat on the porch, under a sky so full of stars it looked like it might spill over. Scout curled up by my feet. Emma came outside with 2 glasses of bourbon and handed me one. We clinked silently. She leaned on my shoulder. "You did good," she said. "I just didn't back down." Sometimes, she said, that's the hardest thing of all. The months passed. Lacey's house sold again, this time to a single dad with twin daughters and a beat-up truck. The girls rode bikes that squeaked and wore mismatched socks, and not one neighbor complained. They were welcomed with casseroles and offers to babysit. The cabin remained untouched, just like Grandpa built it. I fixed what needed fixing, but changed nothing that mattered. The wraparound porch still creaked in the same spots. The dock still leaned slightly left. The flagstone path still caught the morning dew in all the right ways. That winter, Sandra organized the first Clearwater Pines community potluck. No forms, no permits, no guidelines. Just people showing up with food and smiles. I brought chili. Emma made cornbread. Someone played an old guitar, and someone else sang half the words wrong. Nobody cared. By spring, the HOA had been reduced to a simple group chat where neighbors shared tool recommendations and helped plan cleanups after storms. The board still existed, technically, but it was more like a volunteer club. No fines, no fear, just folks. One day, I found a letter tucked under my cabin door. No envelope, just folded once. It was from Robert Williams. I don't expect you to forgive my wife. I'm not sure I have either. But I wanted you to know that leaving Clearwater Pines was the best thing that ever happened to her. And to me, she's in therapy, working, quiet. She asked me to tell you that she's sorry, not for what she lost, but for how many people she hurt trying to hold on to it. I don't expect that to change anything, but maybe someday. You'll be glad to know she's trying. Thank you for standing up not just for yourself but for a place that deserved better. I folded the letter slowly, sat with it for a long time. Then I tossed another log into the fireplace and let it be. Sometimes closure comes without fanfare. Sometimes the best ending is the one that leaves no unfinished business, just space to breathe. On the anniversary of Grandpa's passing, I scattered a few wildflower seeds at the edge of the lake, same ones he used to plant every year. As they drifted down, I whispered a quiet thank you for the memories, for the strength, for the reminder that some battles are worth fighting, even when they're quiet and personal and messy. The lake was still, the sky open, the wind soft. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly how it should. Because in the end, I hadn't just protected my grandfather's cabin. I'd helped rebuild a community, not with rules, but with kindness, not with fines, but with laughter, not with fear, but with courage. And sometimes, that's how you win, not by tearing down the villain, but by lifting everyone else up. Looking back, it's easy to think this story was about revenge, about beating someone at their own game, about proving a point. But the truth is, it was never about Patricia Williams. It was about standing up for something that mattered, about protecting a legacy, about building something real in the ruins of control and fear. My grandfather didn't leave me a fortune. He left me something better, a place, a memory, a reminder of who we are when we're not being told who to be. That lake wasn't just water, it was freedom, and when someone tried to take that away, not just from me, but from everyone around it, I couldn't stay silent. I had to act, even when it was hard, even when it cost more than I expected. The lesson here? Bullies don't always wear black hats. Sometimes they wear name tags and carry clipboards. Sometimes they call it community, when really, it's control. But the power they have? It only works if we give it to them, if we stay quiet, if we let fear win. You don't need to own a lake to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to say no, to speak up, to push back, to believe that your voice matters, even when it shakes. So if you're watching this, and you've got your own HOA horror story, or maybe a Patricia of your own, just know you're not alone, and there's always a way forward, even if it means changing the rules entirely. And if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and comment below. Press 1 if you loved the video and want more justice like this. Press 0 if it didn't hit the mark, so I know how to do better next time. Because this channel, it's for you, for every everyday hero who fought back and won, for every neighbor who refused to be pushed around, and for every story that proves one thing loud and clear.